I set a plate on the kitchen table, the porcelain chipped at the edge, the fork and knife placed neatly as if someone else might join me. A single slice of cake waited there, frosting already softening under the dim glow of the overhead light. I struck a match, lit one candle, and watched the flame tremble, as though it too wasn't sure it belonged here. The house was still, the kind of silence that seeps into your skin and makes you notice the ticking of the clock on the wall. Tonight was my birthday, yet no one had called, no one had knocked on the door. My parents were across town, raising glasses of champagne at my sister's dinner, their smiles wide and documented in photographs I hadn't wanted to see, but stumbled across anyway. I imagined the clatter of dishes, the bursts of laughter, the way my mother's hand rested on my sister's shoulder, while mine went unnoticed. I closed my eyes and felt the wax drip onto the plate, the candle burning for no one but me. And the question pressed against me with the weight of years: when exactly did I stop being worth showing up for? I grew up in a small Midwestern town where family dinners were supposed to be sacred, where every Sunday meant roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the sound of my father's voice telling stories about the past. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family that belonged on postcards: stable, cheerful, dependable. But inside the walls, there was always a split running quietly through us, and it usually showed when attention turned to my younger sister. She was the golden child, the one who filled the rooms with charm and laughter, the one my parents seemed to orbit around without ever noticing how I was drifting further away. I was the reliable one, the girl who came home on time, who did chores without reminders, who kept her grades steady and never caused trouble. And maybe that was my first mistake, because being good meant I was easy to forget. My sister, on the other hand, glowed. She had the kind of personality that demanded notice, from the way she entered a room to the way she told a joke with just enough pause to make everyone laugh. My mother called her our little star, and my father always said she'd go far, while I listened quietly from the side of the table, the words meant for someone else sinking into me like a dull knife. I can still see the day of her high school graduation, when my mother spent hours polishing the silver, setting the dining table with flowers she had picked up from the florist downtown. There were balloons tied to the chairs, a cake with her name in thick pink frosting, and family friends gathered with cameras flashing. I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding a plate of appetizers. I had arranged myself, watching my mother beam as though nothing else mattered. When it was my turn, years earlier, the day passed with a smaller dinner. No balloons, no crowd, just a card slipped across the table. I told myself it was fine, that maybe it didn't matter, but those small differences stacked on top of each other until they felt like bricks pressing down. My sister's successes became family legends: her first job, her engagement, her new apartment. Mine were simply noted, then forgotten. Even when I divorced, when I lay in a hospital bed afterward with exhaustion heavy on me, no one came by to ask how I was doing. They sent flowers, yes, but they never came. And every time I convinced myself to let it go, every time I swallowed the ache, a quiet part of me wondered how much longer I could keep pretending I didn't notice. The week leading up to my birthday, I tried to ignore the unease pressing against me. I told myself this year would be different, that maybe they would finally remember in a way that felt real. I tidied my small house, bought fresh flowers, and laid out the recipe for a modest dinner I planned to cook for all of us if they decided to come. I even bought a cake from the local bakery, simple but elegant, with a single white rose traced in icing. That morning, I woke up early, brewed coffee in my chipped blue mug, and stared at the calendar where I'd circled the date weeks before in red ink like a child counting down to Christmas. The day stretched out long and heavy. I busied myself with cleaning and cooking, simmering a pot of soup, baking rolls, slicing vegetables, waiting for the call that always came late, but usually came. Around noon, my phone buzzed. I reached for it quickly, heart lifting, only to see a short message from my mother. "Sorry, sweetheart, something came up tonight. We'll celebrate later." I reread it twice, the words blurring. There was no mention of what had come up, no apology that felt like it belonged to me. Just a casual dismissal, as if rearranging me was simple. Hours later, scrolling through my phone, I saw the truth. My parents were at a restaurant downtown, seated at a long table surrounded by glowing lights and polished glasses, celebrating my sister's promotion. There she was in a crimson dress, her hair shining, my mother's hand resting proudly on her arm. My father's grin stretched wide as he raised a glass, and in every photo the three of them leaned close, a family without room for me. My stomach turned not just with anger, but with something heavier, a bone-deep ache that whispered of years of being an afterthought. I sat at my own table, soup cooling in its pot, the rolls growing stale, the cake untouched. The candle I had lit melted down into a small puddle of wax, its flame flickering low before it gave up entirely. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat with the silence pressing in, watching the shadows shift on the wall. And when I finally closed my eyes, I asked myself a question that felt like it had been waiting for years. How many times could I be left behind before I stopped waiting altogether? I thought that night would be the only time I felt the weight of being forgotten. But the truth is it had been happening for years, each instance piling on top of the last, until the stack threatened to topple me. My sister had always been at the center, the one my parents reached for, the one who received their loudest applause. The rest of us were the background, and I was the quiet shadow who never demanded more than I was given. But when I look back, the signs were everywhere, clear as glass. I remember her wedding like it happened yesterday. I had offered to help with expenses, chipping in more than I could afford, believing that doing so would matter, that it might be noticed. I spent weekends helping her choose flowers, folding programs at the kitchen table, staying up late to sew small ribbons onto party favors. On the day itself, I arrived early, dressed in a pale dress I had saved for months to buy. I waited in the pews while photographs were taken, family portraits arranged with practiced smiles. My parents pulled my sister close, their arms around her and her new husband. When I asked later if I could get one photo with them, my mother waved her hand as though it wasn't necessary, as though there would be time later. But later never came. The album arrived months afterward, and I was nowhere in it, just a guest blurred in the background of someone else's memory. Christmases carried the same sting. There was the year my sister unwrapped a car in the driveway, its bow glittering red under the porch light, while I received a small kitchen gadget I hadn't asked for. They all laughed and toasted with cider, my father clicking the camera over and over to capture her joy. I stood to the side, clutching my small gift, trying to swallow the lump in my throat before anyone noticed. Birthdays had always been uneven too, though I pretended it didn't bother me. Hers were grand affairs with reservations, balloons, and cake tall enough to lean candles against. Mine came and went, with muted dinners at home sometimes, with no one remembering until late in the evening. I told myself I didn't care, that I was used to it, but the ache never really left. Even during my divorce, when the walls of my life were crumbling, they treated my pain like a small inconvenience. I had spent months holding up a marriage that had collapsed around me, and when it finally ended, I lay in a hospital bed after exhaustion caught me in its grip. I waited for their footsteps in the hallway, for the creak of the door opening, but they never came. They sent flowers, lilies that browned at the edges within a week, but not their voices, not their presence. A neighbor visited, sat with me as I ate gelatin under fluorescent light, but my parents stayed away. I convinced myself they were busy, that my sister's life was demanding their time, but a darker voice whispered that they simply didn't see me at all. I used to replay those moments in my head, trying to understand what I had done wrong, what flaw in me had made me unworthy of celebration, of attention, of love. I thought of the nights I stayed up as a child to wash dishes after dinner, the times I quietly saved my allowance to buy small gifts for my parents, the afternoons I walked home alone from school because my mother was too busy helping my sister rehearse for a play. It was as if my goodness had become my camouflage. I blended into the background because I never made noise, never demanded recognition. And yet in the quiet corners of my memory, I can see the ways it carved me down. The unopened card from my college graduation still sits in a drawer unsigned inside because my mother had forgotten to write the note. A wilted bouquet I bought myself once lay across my counter, drooping, while my parents toasted my sister's new job across town. Even the smallest gestures told me I was secondary, a placeholder, until someone brighter walked in. That night, after my birthday, sitting alone at my table, the truth of it all pressed down on me harder than ever. Every memory returned, each one sharper than before, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. My sister had been their jewel, their pride, while I had been the steady ground they walked over without ever looking down. And in that silence, staring at the cake that no one else had touched, I asked myself the only question left: how long would I keep accepting crumbs and calling them love? The morning after my birthday, I woke with an unfamiliar stillness in my chest, as though the ache had burned itself out and left only a hollow calm. The kitchen still carried the faint smell of wax and sugar, the cake untouched except for the place where the candle had dripped and hardened into a crooked shape. I poured coffee into my blue mug and stood at the window watching the pale light push across the yard. For the first time in years, I didn't wonder if they would call. I didn't wait for footsteps or apologies. Instead, I thought about what it might feel like to create a space where I belonged, a place that did not depend on anyone else's recognition. On my way into town later that morning, I stopped at a small cafe. The air smelled of cinnamon, and students filled the corner tables with laptops and headphones. I carried my mug to the counter and noticed a flyer pinned near the register. Country home for sale. Quiet acreage, serene views. The photograph showed a weathered porch with 2 rocking chairs and fields stretching out beyond a wooden fence. Something in that picture caught hold of me. It wasn't grand, not polished or perfect, but it looked like somewhere I could breathe. I took the flyer, folding it into my bag before I could second-guess myself. The drive out was longer than I expected, winding past barns with peeling paint and wide ditches filled with tall grass. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the house stood, waiting its paint, chipped its roof, sagging just slightly at one corner. Yet it felt alive, like it had been holding its breath for someone willing to see it. I walked up the steps and touched the railing, rough beneath my fingers. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the smell of old wood and dust rushing out to greet me. Light spilled through tall windows, catching the edges of worn floorboards, illuminating spaces that had been empty too long. My heart raced with something I hadn't felt in years, not fear but possibility. I stood in that quiet, listening to the sound of my own breathing, and thought, maybe this is what starting over feels like. Maybe this is where my story can begin again, not as someone's forgotten daughter, but as my own woman, holding the key to a door no one else could open for me. I returned to the house 3 more times before I finally gathered the courage to admit what I already knew: it felt like mine. Each visit revealed something new that pulled me deeper into its quiet spell. The first time, I stood in the kitchen, running my fingers across the sink that faced a window overlooking the fields. The faucet dripped, the counter bore scratches, and the cabinets sagged a little on their hinges, but the sunlight that poured through the glass made it glow in a way that no polished room ever could. The second time, I climbed into the attic. Dust swirled around me in tiny constellations as I pulled the cord for the bare bulb overhead. There were old trunks left behind, empty except for the faint scent of cedar and a single yellowed curtain folded neatly inside one of them. I sat there for almost an hour, imagining what it would be like to place my own boxes here, not ones marked fragile with someone else's handwriting, but boxes that carried only what I chose to keep. The third time, I walked through the yard at dusk, fireflies flickering in the tall grass, while crickets filled the air with their steady rhythm. The sky stretched wide and endless, far removed from the city streets, where I had spent too many nights listening to sirens and pretending I wasn't lonely. Here, the silence wrapped around me like a blanket, and for the first time, I felt safe. Of course, the practical voice in me spoke up. It asked how I would manage the money, whether I was being reckless, whether I was trying to fill a wound with something I couldn't afford. But another voice, quieter and steadier, answered back, "What else is life for, if not to claim something that is finally yours?" I went home and pulled out my savings book, the one I had guarded for years, adding to it bit by bit, never daring to touch it. There was also a small box in my closet that held jewelry. I no longer wore pieces my ex-husband had given me when he still bothered to pretend he cared. I had kept them out of habit, but as I laid them on the table, I realized they meant nothing to me anymore. Selling them felt like releasing a weight I had carried too long. The next week was a blur of paperwork, bank visits, and phone calls that left my stomach tied in knots. Yet every step forward gave me a surge of strength I hadn't expected. I negotiated with the agent, listened to loan officers explain terms I scribbled down carefully, and walked into offices with my shoulders straighter than they had been in years. There was fear, yes, but it came laced with a strange exhilaration. It was the kind of fear that meant you were stepping into unknown territory, not because you were lost, but because you had finally chosen to leave the old map behind. The day I signed the papers, the air felt heavier, like the world was holding its breath with me. I pressed my pen to the page, my name scrawling across lines that bound me to something real, something solid. When the keys slid into my palm, cool and heavy, I closed my fist around them as though they might disappear. I walked out of that office, not as the woman who had been left behind year after year, but as someone who had claimed a piece of the world for herself. That evening, I drove straight to the house. I didn't bring furniture, just a sleeping bag, a pillow, and a thermos of coffee. The gravel crunched under my tires, the porch steps groaned as I climbed them, and when I unlocked the door for the first time, I felt the house breathe with me. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of earth and wood. I spread my sleeping bag in the living room where moonlight streamed through the tall windows and sat cross-legged on the floor. The silence was immense, but it wasn't empty. It was alive with the creaks of settling boards, the rustle of wind against the siding, the distant call of an owl. I poured coffee into a tin cup and drank slowly, letting the warmth settle into me. I thought of my parents then, of the restaurant where they had laughed and toasted my sister while I sat alone. I thought of every time I had waited for their recognition, every time I had convinced myself that if I stayed quiet enough, patient enough, they might one day see me. And I realized that here in this imperfect house with its chipped paint and cracked windows, I was finally seen, if only by myself. The next morning I woke early, the sky streaked with soft pinks and golds. I stepped outside barefoot, the grass cool under my feet, and breathed in air that tasted clean, untouched. For breakfast, I ate a piece of the birthday cake I had brought with me, sitting on the porch as the sun rose higher. It wasn't sweet enough, a little stale from the night before, but I ate every bite. It felt like communion, like claiming back something that had been denied to me. Over the next days, I began to make small changes. I scrubbed the counters, polished the floors, swept out cobwebs. I painted one wall of the living room a warm cream, covering stains and cracks, but leaving the wood beams bare, proud of their age. I bought secondhand furniture from a thrift store in town, mismatched pieces that somehow belonged together. Each brushstroke, each nail hammered, felt like stitching a wound closed. The house didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to hold me honestly. On the third evening, as I sat on the porch with a notebook in my lap, I wrote a single sentence: I am no longer waiting. It wasn't directed at anyone. It wasn't a declaration to prove something. It was simply the truth. The wind carried the scent of cut grass from a neighboring field, and for the first time in decades, I smiled without hesitation. My life was not a stage for their approval anymore. My life was mine, and this house with its quiet strength was the proof I had chosen to keep living on my own terms. I sat on the floor of the living room with my back against the freshly painted wall, staring at the keys lying in my palm. They caught a streak of afternoon sun flashing dull silver against my skin. The decision to share the moment came without much thought. For years I had kept my life small, quiet, invisible. I had kept my victories private, almost as though I was afraid of being noticed. But this time felt different. I picked up my phone, stood near the front window where the light fell warm across my face, and snapped a picture of myself holding the keys. No makeup, no staging, just the truth. My caption was simple: Happy birthday to me. I bought a place where I'll never be forgotten. I hesitated for a moment, thumb hovering over the screen, then pressed post. Almost instantly my phone buzzed with notifications. Old friends from high school commented with surprise and joy. A coworker wrote, "This is amazing, you deserve every bit of happiness." People I hadn't heard from in years sent messages telling me how proud they were, how inspiring it was to see someone step into a life of her own. Each word washed over me like balm on old wounds I hadn't realized were still open. The strangest thing was the silence from my family. Hours passed, then days. No calls, no messages, no acknowledgement that I had made a choice so bold. I checked once, twice, scrolling through their social media. There were new photos of my sister at brunch, her glass of mimosa raised high, my parents beaming beside her. Not a word about me. It was as if my milestone had happened in a different world. At first, the absence stung. I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for some sign that they had noticed that they cared enough to respond. But then something shifted. I realized the silence itself was my answer. For so long I had begged for crumbs. Now I had fed myself. Their absence didn't diminish the joy I felt when I walked barefoot through my new kitchen or sat on the porch watching the stars. It simply underlined the truth I had known for years. I was never going to be enough for them, but here in this house, I was enough for myself. That weekend, I drove into town to pick up a few supplies. At the hardware store, I bought paint rollers, nails, and a hammer. At the market, I picked out fresh bread, cheese, and apples. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if I had moved in nearby. When I told her about the country house, her face lit up. "Oh, you're the one who bought the Franklin place. It's good to see someone finally bringing life back there." I left the store smiling, my bags heavy, but my heart lighter than it had been in years. Back at the house, I spread out my groceries on the kitchen counter and made myself a simple lunch. The bread was crusty, the cheese sharp, the apple crisp. I carried the plate outside, sat on the steps, and ate while the field stretched before me. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a feast, a celebration in its own right. Later that evening, I opened my laptop and looked again at the social media post. Dozens of likes, more comments, each one echoing the same message: they saw me. Not my parents, not my sister, but others who had been on the sidelines of my life were suddenly clapping for me. I realized then that visibility doesn't always come from the people you expect. Sometimes it comes from strangers or acquaintances, and sometimes it comes only from within. That night, I carried the last slice of birthday cake into the kitchen. The frosting had hardened slightly, the edges of the sponge dry, but I placed it on a plate anyway. I lit a single candle and watched the flames stand tall. Then I sat down and ate it slowly, bite by bite, in the quiet of my new kitchen. There was no audience, no applause, no one hovering to make me feel like I mattered. And yet, for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt grounded whole. The house echoed with emptiness, but it was a kind of emptiness that welcomed me. I thought back to the countless nights I had spent scrolling through photos of my sister's milestones, comparing them to my hollow days. I thought of the dinners where my parents had laughed loudly, their eyes never resting on me. And then I thought of this house with its cracked paint and creaking floorboards and knew that it held more love for me than their approval ever had. Over the next week, I began to settle in. I painted the bedroom a soft blue, the color of calm skies, and placed a small vase of daisies on the windowsill. I scrubbed the bathroom until the tiles gleamed, replaced the old shower curtain with one patterned in wildflowers. Every change stitched me tighter into the fabric of this place. One afternoon, as I hammered nails into the wall to hang up my old photographs, I realized how different these pictures felt here. In my old house, they had been just decorations. Here, they felt like proof of a life lived, of memories that were mine alone. I hung a photo of myself as a girl on the front porch, smiling shyly, hair windblown. I wanted to honor her, the girl who had waited so long to be seen, who had kept giving even when she was overlooked. By evening, I walked outside and stood in the yard as the sun lowered. The sky turned gold, then crimson, before fading to deep purple. Crickets sang and the air cooled around me. I wrapped my arms around myself and thought of how far I had come. My parents' silence no longer weighed on me. My sister's spotlight no longer blinded me. I had carved out my own stage, lit by nothing but the steady flame of my own will. And as I walked back inside, closing the door gently behind me, I whispered to myself, I am no longer forgotten. Not here, not ever again. In the weeks that followed, I learned how to breathe in a different rhythm. The house became my anchor, a place where mornings started with the smell of fresh coffee and evenings ended with the soft hum of crickets outside the window. I planted a small garden, my hands deep in the soil, and each sprout that rose reminded me I was still capable of growth. The ache of being overlooked didn't vanish overnight, but it dulled, replaced slowly with the steady warmth of choosing myself. I no longer waited for calls that would never come or for recognition that was never mine to hold. Instead, I lit candles in the kitchen, not for absence, but for presence my own. Sitting on the porch at dusk, I understood something I had chased for years. Dignity doesn't arrive from applause. It rises quietly when you stop begging for it. My parents' silence became background noise, fading into the distance while the life I was building grew louder, brighter. And though the old wounds remain, I carry them differently now as proof that I survived. Sometimes healing isn't a grand revelation. It's simply unlocking a door, stepping inside, and realizing you are finally home.